Good morning. Welcome to the first attempt at a Hebrews Bible study. We're coming out swinging. Okay. As promised and anticipated, we are going this morning into a study of the book of Hebrews. And this morning, we may not necessarily get to the text. Well, we'll be in lots of Hebrews text, but as far as chapter 1, verse 1 type thing, maybe not, but that's okay. We have some things to get straight before we actually delve into the text of the book. So that is what we will be taking care of in this session here this morning. Well, Craig, you're like right in my left-hand line of sight, so great.
From having your thank you for this day of life and the night of rest. For this time to look forward to this look at better things, look forward to all the things to our understanding. All these things, they're all for us to
Amen. Okay. So you notice on the overhead there, that's people that have been around a long time that say overhead. The screen, Hebrews, the supremacy of Christ, and Hebrews does deal with the supremacy of Christ over, I remember when I was being interviewed to begin preaching at Sumner, and one of the brethren said, "Can you give us a chapter by chapter summary of the book of Hebrews?" And I said, no. Now, because I couldn't. And as the years have gone by, I thought, well, I guess I probably could, we can just, wouldn't take long to prepare for that, probably about 45 seconds, just going to flip through it, and then I'll have a better for every chapter, I'm sure. And so it is definitely the book of better things, that supremacy of Christ and other things as compared to the old law. And so we'll mention that here in a little bit, but it's also about something more than the supremacy of Christ, although that something more than is certainly connected to the supremacy of Christ. So anyway, we'll get into that. I thought I would just go ahead and confuse you a little bit and make you go, what's he talking about, before we get going, so you just start it now. So think of the difference between a personal letter and a master's thesis. This is kind of what we're going to be seeing as a pretty good comparison as we get into this book. So Hebrews has been called a sublime writing, and sublime means with thoughts so high, so beautiful, so deep, you have to use a word like sublime, of such excellence, grandeur, beauty, as to inspire great admiration or awe. And so synonyms like exalted, elevated, noble, et al. Have been attached and attributed to the book of Hebrews. So there are some deep things in this book. Okay. And when I talk about, as I told you before, something being deep in my mind, it means that your understanding of it is augmented by your knowledge of other things as you come to. Okay, so it's and so in that vein, then books like Romans and Galatians help us to understand the things that are going to be contained here in the book of Hebrews. In fact, it's going to deal with things that go into greater depth than the book of Romans went into, as deep as that book is. Hebrews is going to go into some things that the book of Romans doesn't deal with. And so that's why I often refer to the book of Hebrews as an inspired commentary on the Old Testament. And so we're going to find a deeper relationship or understanding of the relationship of the entire old law. Now, this is sounding like, oh man, we're going to be doing this forever, right? And its ceremonies, things like the priesthood and the sacrifices and the temple services. It'll go into things dealing with those things that Romans didn't go into. Romans had a little bit different emphasis, of course. So the question then is, to what level of detail are we going to go in studying this book? Okay. How long did you guys have to go? 2 years? 1 year. Okay. 1 year would be easy. You're 1 year in Romans. I mean, you got to take into account it's 50 minutes a week. Okay, so to say a year, if you took those 50 minutes and put them together, would be about in a year, right? So yeah, so I'll have to use some discretion with regard to how much detail, and I'll define that here in a little bit. So let's just kind of look at some things. Release the clicker. Release. There we go. All right. So we're going to look at some of these basic questions that usually go along with an introduction to a book, and talk about some of these things a little bit, and answer some questions as we go. So when was Hebrews written? What I came up with sometime between 68 and 95 AD, okay? Which I kind of question a little bit, but that's okay. We might refine that later, but that's what turned up on that. Oh, Bible. At some point, this thing comes in handy. Always does, it seems. Okay. So if I said that the book of Hebrews was written before the destruction of Jerusalem, and I said that with confidence, why might I say that? Okay. Yeah, Tony? Does it mention the destruction of Jerusalem? That's for sure. If you'll notice in chapter 10, in verse 11, the writer says, every priest stands daily, present tense, ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. And so when Hebrews was written, the temple was still standing and the sacrifices were still being offered, right? Which fact lends itself to some conclusions here as we go. So when did they stop serving in the temple? 870 AD, when it was destroyed, then those services stopped. And so it seems pretty safe to say that when this book was written, the temple was standing. And you think about that now, what is something that's outstanding in the book of Hebrews about the people and the society? The Hebrews, the people to whom this book was addressed, and the society around them, the Jewish society. What was their relationship with other Jews? Because these are Jewish Christians. When we talk about to whom it was written to Jewish Christians. And what was their relationship to Jews who had not embraced faith in Christ? You remember, Tony? They were persecuted. They were chapter 10 really goes into some of the detail of that. We'll talk about that when we get there. And so, yeah, so that's the relationship they had. And so when we talk about to whom this book was written, okay, in chapter 13, verse 12 is where we'll go. And 13:12 says, therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Okay. So let us go out to him. Let's go to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come. Right. And so he talks about that city in chapter 11, where they're seeking a heavenly city. Right. And so what do we have here then? So we have a book written to a group of Jewish Christians who were, how are they doing, by the way, with these Jewish Christians with their Christian faith? How was that going for them? Okay, still shaking her head? No? Yeah,
They're falling back.
yeah, they were starting to fall back, okay, which is a clue to the other part of why this book was written. Besides the supremacy of Christ, that's a clue to, we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about why it was written. So it was, so they were being persecuted because of the pressure of persecution and attachment to the law of Moses. They're starting to fade back. Okay. And he's writing to people apparently in a city, because he says, here we have no lasting city. Okay. And so sounds like they live in a city, right? And so what is the camp? So let us go to him outside the camp. So we have no lasting city. So let us go to him outside the camp. Let me ask you, what do you think that would mean, that language, to a Gentile? Okay. Wouldn't mean much to a Gentile, right? What would they make of that? Okay. Now, granted, they could have heard people talking, this and that, maybe would identify that with the city that he's talking about. And of course, Jesus suffered outside the camp, and that was Jerusalem. Okay, and so that really wouldn't mean much to Gentiles. So it's pretty clear to whom the book was written. By whom? This is by whom was Hebrews written? Ever heard any discussion on that question? Yeah, lots of discussion on who wrote it. Now, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time talking about who wrote it. And the main reason is because God didn't say who wrote it, right? So it is of marginal benefit for us to spend a bunch of time. Now, it's fun, intriguing to conjecture. We might hit on it a little bit in chapter 13. And I say that because there are people who, because of how chapter 13 ends, how the book ends, who think that if Paul didn't write the letter, that he wrote the last chapter. It so points to Paul. But be that as it may, God did not reveal who the writer was, and so we're not going to spend a bunch of time speculating on that. And there's no record, and so we're going to pass on when it comes to who wrote it. Because what's the most important thing that we have to consider? It isn't the human writer. It's the divine writer and the message that he wants to get across. That's what's important. Okay. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on. And fourthly, why was this book written? And this is important, isn't it? Because if the why doesn't somehow touch us, not much point in going through it if it has nothing to do with you and I. So yes, it was written to Jewish Christians for sure, but you know, it's superfluous for me to say that there are unspeakably great lessons in this book for us. Okay. And we'll talk about why that is, but that's first of all a clear thing. And so why was it written? Well, it was written first of all for the same reason that Galatians was written. And so that's why I mentioned earlier, if you have the knowledge of Galatians, then that makes it easier to understand this book. Because why was Galatians? By the way, well, I had a whole bunch of phrases right there. You had to pick one. I'm not going to treat you guys like novice Bible students. All right. So I'm going to, I'll go to throw chapter 5 at you for the time. We ought to have some knowledge in this room. But at the same time, understand when I ask questions, it's not input into how much she knows or how much that's not really the point, is to think. All right. And, so anyway, when it comes to Galatians, why was Galatians written? What was the point of that? Same reason Hebrews was written. But what was it? What was it? Remember how chapter 3 of Galatians starts out? You foolish Galatians. Why was he calling them foolish? Yeah. Having begun in the spirit, you're not going to be made, perfect by the flesh. That's not Daryl's translation. And so you're going to go back to the law. And it's either law or faith. Right? I don't need faith if there's Romans, okay, if I'm going to go that way. So yeah, it was the same written. Christians have or are in imminent danger of falling away from the faith. That's why it was written. Now that's just a pregnant statement. Okay. There is so much in there that you can feel that the application that this is going to have for us. Okay. These people were sorely tempted to go back to their old religion. I've heard people say from time to time, it would just be so much easier if I was. You ever heard somebody say that? I wouldn't have to worry about it. If you ever say that to yourself, go back and read Psalm 73 and Asaph, and he basically said the same thing. Why am I washing my hands in innocence? It's just look at people who don't serve God. And this is Daryl's bad paraphrase. People who don't even serve God, they're doing just great. Their children are fat. Everything is, wonderful for them. And here I am laboring away, and what's the point? So you imagine you are being persecuted. Terribly persecuted for being a Christian. And maybe the thought might cross your mind under that circumstance that maybe this, what we human beings do, we're really good at compromising or rationalizing. We can rationalize anything. Now I say that out of experience. Okay, I have rationalized pretty serious stuff in my life that didn't deserve it. But we can do that. And so if you're under persecution and things are really hard, that can be a temptation. Yeah.
I agree that they were being persecuted by the Jews, but they were also dealing with the, converts from Judaism that were forwarding or convincing people that they still had to maintain certain aspects of the law. And there was need to really all defend himself as well as, explain the superiority of Christ for the people, right?
Yeah, that was a problem in New Testament times. Acts 15 and the Council of Jerusalem underscores that very thing. The book of Galatians, book of Romans. I mean, it was a big problem. People saying that you must be circumcised and keep the law of Moses, which, as we know, you can't be in Christ and believe that keeping the law of Moses, that the law is necessary for salvation. So you're absolutely right, Chris.
Yeah, but to give a little bit of empathy to the Jews who were coming over, they were coming over from an authorized covenant of God to an authorized covenant. And so there's two things that can happen. One is for people who want to, they can create a whole lot of confusion because they know what the old scriptures say, they use what they don't need to, they don't use what they don't need to, and then that creates that. The other thing is, you then, when you're mounted with pressure, it's not mounting with pressure to say go against God. It's saying, well, yeah, it's God plus, right? It's God, it's Jesus, yes, but we still got to do the things that God wanted us to do. You could see the argument being made. You could see human wisdom just permeating this, and so that does two things. One is it makes me feel for the Christians at that time, the Hebrew Christians that were trying to do that. It also makes me aware of how we need to be when we're looking at the scriptures, to really, really take a deep look at understanding it in them, because if you don't, confusion can come in. And that's why God had to spend so much time, I think, warning us against false teachers because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Very good. So the people, Gina, do you have something?
One of the things that jumps out at me is that, like Chris was talking about, they were coming out of a thing that was sanctioned by God, in this law, and their life was probably so much easier with their family, their friends, with the people that were around them, just keeping the law, if you will. However, I think it's really neat that if the writer reminds them that even those who were held of such high esteem in the course of the law, by faith, they had to suffer a lot of stuff. And so to me, he's like writing this to encourage them. Just because you're suffering, hang on to the faith.
Yeah.
The faith is what's really important.
Yeah, and to what Chris said, these were people who they knew the Old Testament. You're talking about their friends and acquaintances and whatnot. In talking to them, the pressure that they would have as a result of when you think about Paul never tossed away the Old Testament, turned his back on it. He was still a Jew. These people are still Jews, right? They haven't just thrown the law away. So people coming from their background, their shared community life, all of that together. I mean, I don't think we can really appreciate the kind of pressure they were under. Okay. And
Well, even
so,
in Romans and Corinthians, right, what does he say? He says, hey, you know what, if you're going against your conscience, there's certain festivals and stuff and certain things. If it's going against your conscience, don't do it, right? Well, why? Well, because they're transitioning. From an operational standpoint, there were certain things, but not from a covenant standpoint. And I think that's what Hebrews does, and Galatians does a phenomenal job at talking covenant, not sort of like. Yeah, so there's a difference.
yeah, Tony?
And these people have been such in common. I mean, as far as they talk about you and the former days, and you gave up the property,
Yeah.
you did all this. Carolyn, you approach against, so,
Mhm.
you know, persecution after a length of time. It's like I said, it's automatic, that find ways, things.
Yeah, where'd you go?
Yeah.
I would imagine, I'm not gonna stand here and say, oh, I can relate. You know, I can't. But I would imagine that that's gonna wear you, that's gonna wear you down over time, you know, especially. And so when people, you know, obviously, when they fall away, whether it was these Jewish Christians falling back to the old law, or whether it's a Christian today falling away, usually we're going to fall back to what we used to do. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense to fall back to something we never did. It's going back to those old things. So what does the writer want to accomplish? He wants to so impress upon his readers the infinitely superior, how infinitely superior the Christian faith is over anything the world has to offer. It is so far superior that this temptation to go back to Judaism will be defeated. Now, what happens, do you suppose, while this writer is impressing that upon his hearers, and we're listening to him do that? What do you suppose the impact might be upon us? Let's put it this way, that the more you read and understand this book, the less likely it will be that you will go astray. Okay? The less likely, if you, I mean, I don't know about you, but we're going to spend the rest of our time here this morning looking at this other aspect as to the purpose of this book, the supremacy of Christ, but we're going to look at this other aspect. But I don't know about you, but as I go through my life, if there is something that comes into my consciousness from out there in that spiritual realm that doesn't pass the P48 test. Okay, you know what the P48 test, right? Philippians 4:8, whatever it is, whatever it is. Okay. It is not at all uncommon that what I'm going to replace automatically, replace that thought with is something out of the book of Hebrews. Now, here's why I say that. Because this writer is going to confront his readers with some very serious implications of refusing to hear God's word and heed his warnings. Okay. So not only are we talking about the supremacy of Christ over all, but along with that, and you can see why this is, he's going to warn them in various ways and through various kinds of language about what would happen if they don't pay attention. So this is the other aspect of this. And the main warning, I think that the rest of them sort of revolve around is here in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1. So first of all, to restate it, the objective of this writer is to establish the supremacy of Christ and the Christian faith. Number two, in order to, okay, here's where it's connected, in order to prevent Christians from drifting away from Christ to something inferior. And I will say without hesitation that there is no New Testament book that contains more warnings regarding the latter than the book of Hebrews, regarding drifting back to something inferior. So this primary warning, in my view, is here in Hebrews 2:1. Therefore, now that therefore is carrying a lot with it. Okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff in that therefore, which we will get to. But he says, therefore, so based on what he has just taught, heavy duty stuff, he says, we must pay. This is not optional. Much closer attention. So if you're paying attention, he says, pay much closer attention. Now, that is especially applicable to these Hebrews, as chapter 5 indicates, because they should, at this point in their Christian life, be able to teach other people, but they've been held back. Okay. So he says we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard. So the what we have heard is what we're going to be dealing with when we go into the text. Okay, what have they heard? Because based upon what they have heard, they need to understand that we better be paying way closer attention to that, lest, or so that we don't drift away from it. Yeah.
Yeah, this is an awesome point, because this is a really interesting transition. Unlike like 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, he's talking about the resurrection of Christ, he says, search the scripture, right? But he's talking about the Old Testament. He's talking about, they didn't have the scriptures here. Here is pay closer attention to what we have heard. And so the late date of this book says that these letters that have been written by Paul have been circulating.
Oh yeah.
This stuff's been communicated either miraculously or by note, a whole bunch of different ways, right? So in this case, he's talking about the precepts, the principles gathered in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that's such a powerful statement to these Hebrew Christians.
Absolutely. Robert?
I was just gonna say that a number of the commentaries I've read, many of the individuals that were, again, teaching and encouraging the saints at this time were eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ. So again, we say have heard, they heard it from the source, right?
Yeah. Now, the sermon this morning is going to just dovetail, or this is going to dovetail into it, one of the two. I'm not sure which. But it really is going to be germane to what we're talking about. It's not going to be out of the book of Hebrews, but you'll see. Okay, so just pay attention. You'll see the connections here that are going to be made. All right, so very good. All right, let's look in chapter 3, verse 15. Hebrews 3:15. Now, He says, it as it is said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Okay. Now, one of the things that we're going to see in this book is these interfaces between what the Hebrew writer is saying and the Old Testament. Okay. And so this one is, if we go back to the book of Psalms in chapter 95, this is where this allusion here in this quotation is coming from. Okay. And if you'll notice in verse 7, for he is our God, we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years, I loathed that generation and said, they are a people who go astray. Okay, you catch that? Okay, drifting away, who go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Therefore, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Now, you just ponder that. Okay. These Israelites in their pilgrimage out of Egypt, the writer is using this as a negative model, if you will, for our pilgrimage in living the Christian life, and living a life of faith. So they on that journey straight. So they come out of Egypt, the plagues and all that is behind them. They saw the mighty power of God. Their firstborn put to death in Egypt. They come out through the Red Sea, and they're apparently believing and trusting in God. And he's making a point here that it is important that we do not follow that same example. We don't follow the same example. I mean, they had a great beginning. So many people came out of Egypt only to flounder in the wilderness. Okay. So they go from this tremendous trust in God to a tremendous falling away from God. Right? So notice again in Hebrews 3, these, you've heard these questions time after time again, but notice the striking questions that he asked them at the last part of Hebrews chapter 3. He says, first of all, for who were those who heard and yet rebelled? Okay. Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? So this is important. Do not, well, maybe I'll put it in a positive. Set your inner Pharisee aside and understand that these people were believers. He's not talking to people who hadn't had any faith in God, who had no evidence of God. These were people who came out of Egypt having witnessed God's mighty works. Okay. So that's who they were. And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? Okay. So for 40 years. Now, we understand that 600,000 people died in that wilderness. Because they drifted away on the journey. And it's important for us, if we are going to extract the greatest benefit from this study, to understand and keep in mind who he's talking to, who he's talking about, who were these people. And then he says, or asks, and to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? God told them they were people who had been told by God what was expected of them, which was to trust him, to go into that land and put it in his hands and take the land that he was giving them. But they refused to believe him. And this is the explanation that the writer gives in verse 19, when he says, so we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. Okay. So all those people died in the wilderness because they didn't believe God. And how do we know they didn't believe God? Because they didn't obey him. Okay. So here's that inner Pharisee that we're going to shine the light on it or her. Because a person might say, hey, we're Christians here. You know, we have heard the gospel. We have accepted the gospel. We were baptized for the forgiveness of our sins. We're added to the church. We're God's people. What do we need these points? People out there that need the warnings. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of, right? I give tithes of all that I get. I'm not like those people out there. So look, do you believe Philippians 1:6, which says that he who began a good work in you will complete it until the day of Christ? You believe that? Yeah, that's it. That is absolutely true. But listen carefully. Such affirmations do not make a fiction out of these warnings. They don't mean we don't need to heed warnings, right? Because we too can drift away. And whatever oh yeah, go ahead.
That's just, I mean, well, Hebrews 2:2, right? How shall we escape? We neglect so great a salvation.
Yeah.
And so that is a statement to Christians. So you have Christians who are on the verge of not escaping because of neglecting the salvation that they've already professed Christ, and been baptized into him. I mean, so it's your point's right on. This is a complete emphasis on Christians. I think we too often spin things to the other guy. Yeah, the other guy, right? There's other folk out there. Yeah, and that's not this book.
That's right. Yeah, Tony.
We can have confidence in saying salvation.
Yeah.
Salvation. It doesn't say we had to. I'm not saying because I had to.
Right.
It's because I have it now.
Yeah.
And we can know whether we have it.
Yeah. So in closing, you know, I think about when I think about drifting, I think about Hurricane Gilbert, and we were in Jamaica. Hurricane Gilbert came through, and it was like being in a washing machine. I mean, everything was flying everywhere outside, and you don't have windows in Jamaica. You just have slats, Okay, and so they're, you know, everything was just going crazy, but down, we could look down into Montego Bay and there was a ship anchored in the middle of the bay. And you'd look out there and you'd see that ship. I mean, everything was just going crazy. And, but you didn't see it moving. But then you go do something else, you come around and you happen to glance out there again, and that ship is over here now. But you don't see it moving. You know, and every time you look out, it's in another spot, but you don't see it moving. Now watch what drifting is like. Okay? You don't see it, but it's little by little by little. Okay? And that's why the word has got to be taught and preached as it is, and no compromise. Okay, in season and out of season. Okay, because if we don't, that's where that drift is going to start going. Thank you very much. We're over time. Class Smith will pick up on us next week. Lord permit.